Hi, I'm Nina Melendez, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, a show about the world of work and our place in it. Today, we are talking about the war in Ukraine. Ukrainian officials are warning of more fighting in the east. According to the New York Times, there are fears of a full-scale military confrontation involving tanks, aircrafts, and artillery. Today, Germany's foreign minister called for more military support, but Ukrainian officials are still saying it's not enough. Well, with us today is just the person to help us understand the nuances of this war, and he is here to answer all of our questions. Joining me now is General David Petraeus. He is partner at the investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. He held several fellowships and professor roles at Harvard and Yale, among others. He is a former director of the CIA, and prior to that, spent 37 years in the U.S. Army and retired as a four-star general. He held 6 commands as a general officer, 5 of which were combat, including the surge in Iraq, U.S. Central Command, and NATO and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He got his bachelor's from West Point, and he got his PhD from Princeton. General, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Nina. Thank you.
I have run out of breath just talking about all of your accolades. It's wonderful to have you here with us as such an expert. Let's just start, first of all, why is Russia focusing their efforts right now in the southeast part of Ukraine?
Well, because they didn't succeed in what they originally set out to do, which was to take the capital, Kyiv, in the northern part of the country. They hoped to drive right into that, to topple the government and to replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure, and presumably then have a victory parade and perhaps go home. It didn't work out that way. It turned out that they vastly underestimated the capabilities of the Ukrainian forces and, frankly, the resistance of the Ukrainian people writ large. And they greatly overestimated their own capabilities. This large operations like this are very, very hard. And if you haven't done them before, and they have not really, their operations in Georgia and in Syria have been relatively modest compared to what it is that they undertook to do in Ukraine. So eventually what they did is they withdrew their forces from outside Kiev. They never really got to the central part of the city. They also withdrew their forces from 2 other major northern cities, Chernihiv and Sumy. They have sought to reconstitute them to a degree because they took very considerable losses. Again, the Ukrainians did very, very well, and they were armed with very sophisticated US and UK and other country provided anti-tank guided missiles that proved very lethal against their armor systems, and also Stinger shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles that also proved to be very lethal for planes and helicopters that were below 10,000 feet. They decided to regroup. They declared that their phase 1 goals had been met, and now they're focusing on the southeastern part of the country where they've had modest success, albeit very hard fought and very costly. But this is a perilous moment for Ukraine, make no mistake about it. They can celebrate a bit having won the battles of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy in the north, but not for very long, because they have to reconstitute their forces and reposition them as quickly as they can to the southeast, where the Russian focus is now, and could actually provide the kind of success, if you will, in quotes, that Vladimir Putin could present to his country on 9 May, which is when they celebrate World War II at the victory parade, and say we've now been successful in our latest conquest as well.
Let's talk a little bit about that military support that you were talking about earlier. As you said, the EU nations and U.S. have given money and or military support. Ukrainian officials are saying it's still not enough. What more needs to be done to provide adequate equipment to Ukraine to fight Russia?
Well, first, again, a very, very substantial amount of equipment has been provided. One of the challenges is that although we can give them certain weapon systems that they can pretty quickly pick up and learn how to use and don't require a great deal of maintenance, it's much harder when it comes to the so-called major end items that they want, say tanks, armor personnel carriers, multiple launch rocket systems, artillery, aircraft, and so forth. All of these that they have are what are called Eastern Bloc systems. They're basically old Soviet repurposed, refurbished, or made in Eastern Bloc. In fact, Ukraine has its own arms industry that is really quite substantial, again, that used to serve the Soviet Union very well. And obviously, when they went separate ways, it has helped the Ukrainian armed forces. The challenge is we don't have those kinds of systems. For example, our artillery is 155 millimeter. Theirs is 152. It just doesn't work. So what NATO has sought to do, what the US has sought to do, is facilitate the provision of those systems in Eastern Europe, which have the Eastern Bloc systems from when they were part of the Warsaw Pact under the days of the Soviet Union, and that they can provide to Ukraine. For example, Slovakia provided the S-300 air defense systems. It's quite a good air defense system, and it's accurate above 10,000 feet. That's the threshold for the Stinger. And so that was transferred, and then the U.S. backfilled that with our Patriot system, our air defense, air and ballistic missile defense system. There's another transaction that's taking place. Czech Republic was providing the same kind of tanks to Ukraine that they have, and presumably there will be some kind of Western backfill. There's a variety of these kinds of transactions ongoing, and the same goes for ammunition. Again, we just don't have the ammunition that they use in their howitzers and their multiple launch rocket systems and in their air defense systems and so forth. So that'll have to come from Eastern Bloc nations that have it left over from decades ago, and can then have it replaced with more Western NATO system, NATO standard system. That's a bit of a cumbersome process. It's not quick. The U.S. has provided far and away more help for Ukraine than any of the other countries, probably all of them put together. But many are providing very important capabilities. The UK deserves particular mention. They were the first actually to provide the anti-tank guided missiles for anti-armor missions. They've also slapped the most sanctions on Russia, although again, the US, EU, and others have put very considerable amounts of sanctions as well. And the UK just announced the provision of anti-ship missiles. That's a first providing for them. But we are providing more of these very lethal Javelin anti-armor guided missiles, more of the Stingers, and also something called the Switchblade drone, which is essentially a loitering munition that's launched very easily out of a tube, a little bit like a mortar tube. It then goes up and it loiters, depending on whether it's the light version or the heavy version, for 15 or 30 minutes. The operator selects a target using the feed from the camera that's on that munition. It then dives on that target and blows it up. And it could be particularly lethal if we can get enough of those. Part of the problem is we don't have a huge amount in our own arsenal. Some of it, the heavy version of it, is actually a relatively new addition to our own arms and munitions. So these are the issues that they're working on. I did talk to someone in the Pentagon last night, as a matter of fact, who I know well. We were in uniform together during the war years and worked very closely together. And we went into some detail about this, and I'm convinced that we're doing literally all that we can do. But if I were in President Zelensky's shoes as the commander-in-chief, or as frankly, as the commander in Iraq or in Afghanistan, I was never satisfied either. There are always additional weapon systems, people, money, bandwidth, even 25 megahertz channels on the satellites were never sufficient for us. And certainly the drones were something that we were always calling for more of. So that, I think, is understandable. The question is, how perilous a moment is this for Ukraine? I fear that it's a pretty perilous moment because the Russians have made, again, modest success, but they've got a lot of battalions stacked up that they have repositioned from north of Ukraine and northeast of Ukraine down to the east to reinforce, again, the modest gains that the Russian forces there have achieved so far. But you never know when they could achieve a breakthrough. And I think that's what President Zelensky rightly is concerned about. Keep in mind that to just move Ukrainian forces from Kyiv down to the so-called Donbass, the area of this fighting, it's 450 to 500 miles. So this is not a trivial distance. It's a very substantial logistical feat. And that's what they're attempting to do right now.
General, President Zelensky told 60 Minutes over the weekend, quote, I think that today no one in this world can predict what Russia will do. In your opinion, is this what makes Putin such a formidable opponent?
Well, he's a very formidable opponent for a number of reasons. One is that it does not appear that he is bothered by the extraordinary casualties that his forces have been taking. They've already lost a number more soldiers, a good bit more soldiers, maybe 50 or more percent more than they lost in 9 years of war in Afghanistan. They've lost 3 or 4 times what we lost in 20 years in Iraq. And as the commander there at the height of that effort, I felt that we had very, very tough weeks. We had nothing like what they've experienced. And he seems to be impervious to this. He's just shoving more in there. Beyond that, the Russian economy is about as well suited as any economy could be to withstand the enormous sanctions on Russia's economy, financial system, business community, and Putin's own inner circle. And he seems impervious to the fact that 250,000 to 300,000 of his best and brightest citizens have finally given up on their home country and voted with their feet, left the country now that it has become an international pariah. The tragedy is, though, that they have crude oil, natural gas, and coal that the rest of the world actually needs and can't do without. And so they're going to continue to run a trade surplus despite all of these very significant sanctions. Now, we'll keep ratcheting them down more and more and more, but that's part of the problem. He is a truly authoritarian leader on whom there appear to be no limitations or constraints, certainly within his own government.
You know, the Ukrainian defensive has been so tough and so efficient, as you said. What do you suppose is part of that? Is it just the desire to protect their country, because they're not as sophisticated as the Russian offensive is? So what is it about when you look at it?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that despite the supposed huge investment that Russia made in its military, what we see is really, in many respects, a throwback to the Cold War. I spent my years, of course, in the first couple of decades that I was in the military, where the focus of our effort and the world was on the NATO Warsaw Pact face-off. In other words, the U.S. and the Soviet Union and our respective alliances. And what we expected to come across the inner German border in those days was very much what has come across the Ukrainian border in the 21st century. It's tanks from that era in many respects. Yes, they've been refurbished, updated a bit, but they're nothing as sophisticated as we thought they would have. They don't even seem to have secure communications throughout the force sufficiently. In fact, we hear all kinds of recorded conversations because they're transmitting in high frequency radios in the clear. And that can be picked up by anybody with a scanner, a ham radio operator, what have you.
And they have been.
They are. And
yeah,
we hear them. So it's amazing that they really have not. The sophistication of the drones that we expected has not been seen. The cyber capabilities they have not been seen. And beyond that, just the sheer training levels of them are shockingly low. The soldier quality and performance of tasks has been surprisingly inadequate. They have not achieved what are called combined arms effects. In other words, you don't just roll tanks alone down the road. You have infantry with them, you have engineers, you have artillery, you have helicopters over top of it. They don't have a radio that can communicate from ground to air effectively the way that we do. You know, we have frequency hopping secure radios, not even just single channel secure. So again, a lot of the shortcomings are really quite notable. And on the other hand, you have the Ukrainians who have roughly the same equipment. Again, they all have the same military heritage, if you will. The senior Ukrainian officers, for example, all had their formative years actually in the days of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine was a republic in the Soviet Union. But they have received very sophisticated elements from the West that, combined with what they have enabled them to fight very effectively. Beyond that, of course, they're fighting for the very survival of their nation. And that has an enormous amount of moral content to it, as one would expect. You also see that they know the home turf. They're fighting on their own soil. In some cases, they're fighting from their own homes. I mean, they're literally going out, doing a tour on the front lines north of Kyiv, and then going home for the night, perhaps. And then they do another tour. So again, this is deeply personal for them in a way that it cannot be for any invader, frankly. And I say that having invaded a country when I was a commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division as a 2-star general in March of 2003. Beyond that, I think the Ukrainians have also shown not just heart and not just determination just sheer resilience. They're showing enormous resourcefulness, capacity for initiative. These are the qualities that we treasured in our soldiers. And again, they just, in the absence of orders, they figured out what they should have been and they executed aggressively. That's what you're seeing the Ukrainians do. On the other side, again, on the Russian side, you see no evidence of a professional non-commissioned officer corps. That's long been a deficiency there. And really not a sense of initiative in their junior officers either. So you have a real contrast between a force that is really fighting for their own survival, their own nation, and so forth, and also showing enormous creativity and have the support of the entire country. Again, keep in mind that President Zelensky allowed women and children to leave the country, but welcomed the retention of women who are willing to stay and fight, and all men were required to stay and fight. So
well, there's a new general in town on the Russian side, Alexander Dvornikov. How will this change the trajectory of the war and Russia's offensive?
Well, it's an interesting question because, again, one of the other critiques of the campaign at the beginning was that Russia attacked over so many different axes of advance that they really didn't truly focus on any one of them the way that arguably they should have. There has to be a main effort and it has to be resourced above all others. Beyond that, they had several different commanders, all of whom it appeared reported directly to Moscow, as opposed to having, again, one battlefield commander, as I was privileged to be, as we mentioned earlier, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where everyone, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, even Coast Guardsmen, and even civilian contractors worked for that one commander. That's called unity of command. They did not have that. They now do have it. Alexander Dvornik his nickname is the Butcher of Syria. And he earned that because he oversaw a very brutal campaign there in 2016 in particular. So we can expect tragically to see more of what we have seen. In fact, one of the recent cases is the bombing, of course, of that rail station that killed over 50 innocent Ukrainian civilians trying to get out of the southeastern area and get to the west and away from the fighting. And again, I fear that we will see more of this. In fact, I probably should note that it appears also from intercepted radio calls and so forth that the Russians not only are not troubled by killing of innocent civilians, but they've actually been directed to do so in a number of cases. And this appears to be the norm, their culture, rather than an aberration or an exception. We made mistakes in the years that I was privileged to command downrange. We had Abu Ghraib in the early days. That's before I was the overall commander, but nonetheless, it was our force that did that. But we sought to learn from this. We tried to make changes to mitigate the risks of them in the future. The same,
and Russia does not seem to be taking.
This is the norm for them. This is, and it is really shocking. Obviously, it is a complete violation of the Geneva Convention and the law of land warfare.
I want to pause the conversation very quickly and say hello to so many people joining us from around the world. Actually, we've got Rocco from Germany, Dana from Minnesota, John from Ohio, Shine from Africa, Ashley from Virginia. And I have a question actually from Cello. He says, providing weapons and military assistance to Ukraine seems like a solution, and it is for now, but does it solve the problem? Deep question. What do you think, General Petraeus?
Well, ultimately, the problem of a Putin-led Russia obviously stems in part from Putin, although it also stems, I think you should point out, from a system that has long been characterized by the kind of authoritarian regime that Putin heads at this time. So I think we should be, number one, very, very careful. I think we should have learned from the last 20 years that regime change is not always the smoothest of transitions. It doesn't always turn out quite as hopefully as folks think. But clearly that is a challenge. And as long as he is the head of Russia and appears impervious to the kinds of losses that Russia is suffering on the battlefield, and of course the losses in armored vehicles are in the thousands. There is a very careful count of this that is verified. And the Ukrainians have actually captured over 1,000 armored vehicles from Russia, to give you some sense of the scale of the losses that they're achieving. But obviously the human loss, which is way, way over 15,000 soldiers just in the first 6+ weeks, is enormous. And yet he seems to be impervious to this and is shoving additional soldiers into this. Our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who's four-star general retired, who I was privileged to soldier with during the surge in Iraq and later on when he was the commander there, one after me, he said that the Russians are feeding their forces into a wood chipper. And I think that's a fair analogy of what has happened. But that is a challenge, clearly, and we can try all that we can to influence decision making in the Kremlin, but we should recognize that there are limitations to what it is that we can do. What we can do, however, is deter them from even thinking about going onto NATO soil, expanding the war, and hopefully from entertaining any notion of using any weapon of mass destruction.
You know, saying that feeding the soldiers into a wood chipper. I mean, there were also reports of Russian soldiers saying, "I just want to go home. What are we doing here? I want to go home." Is there a world where the Russian soldiers look around and say, "What are we doing in Ukraine? We're losing. We don't have the right equipment. We don't have the right communication or leadership," and there being some sort of, non-advancement or and anything like the soldiers not going as far as Putin wants them to? Or is that...
There have been isolated incidents of this, but again, it is not the norm. Again, there are recorded calls that indicate the kinds of feelings that soldiers have had. But again, it's not something I would necessarily count on. And again, Alexander Dvornikov, the new overall commander, I think is not going to hesitate to keep pushing very, very hard and to use the destructive capacities that Russia does have. The one area in which they have excelled has been just sheer destruction. Excelled, I guess, should have quotes around it, but the destruction of civilian infrastructure, killing of innocent civilians without apparent concern, and again, just pushing soldiers into battles, whether they have all of the enablers, as we call them, aligned to support them or not. And again, mass does have a quality, quantity has a quality of its own, and Russia has a fair amount of this. What we don't know is how much is left. The estimates are that some 75 or more % of all the available Russian ground forces have been committed, and they're scouring the rest of Russia, the Eastern Military District, Georgia, Syria, even the Wagner military contracting group, security group, has been pressed into action. We just don't know how much more they have beyond what it is that they're committing right now. And that's another unknown, certainly, that a lot of people are trying to track by tracking individual battalion tactical groups and so forth.
General, there are some countries that have been somewhat neutral. India, for example, they depend on Russian energy. China, to a degree, though, although they have participated in the misinformation campaign. How important would it be if these countries joined the fight on the Russian side?
Well, it's very important that, again, objective facts be shared with the world. And when disinformation or misinformation is propagated, obviously that is troubling. It's always going to be a challenge. I will say that when I was privileged to be the commander of the surge in Iraq and later in Afghanistan, that our view with dealing with the press, the guidance was to try to be first, beat the bad guys to the headlines, but be first with the truth. Don't put lipstick on a pig. Don't try to sugarcoat something that shouldn't be. Don't spin because it will undermine your credibility. Not all countries are concerned about that. And again, we should also understand that there are some economic issues that are not trivial for countries and long-time relations for countries. Let's keep in mind that India was a leader of the non-aligned movement. It still is a member of the BRICS group. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They buy a lot of their military hardware from Russia, always have, and are continuing to do so, even as they are strengthening a relationship with the United States and increasing their purchases from us. So again, these require a degree of of understanding. That doesn't mean that you applaud it, but again, you work with it, you understand the reality that they're facing. And indeed, I think it will be difficult over time among our staunchest NATO allies because prices are going to go up. Inflation is on the rise, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. And, if you're sanctioning oil, natural gas, and coal, at some point that will have an effect on markets. And you're going to see results that correlate with that. So this is why I think our president said there will be some pain that we have to bear. We have banned gas, oil, and I assume coal from the United States. We're not going to import any of it, but that's much easier for a country that is, number one, a net gas and oil exporter, and number two is just not as reliant, again, on Russian gas, oil, and coal for sources of energy.
So before I let you go, I want to ask you, what do you think that people don't understand about this kind of conflict? I mean, it's so easy to be armchair commanders, but what do you think the average person is missing when we talk about this war?
Well, I think initially the misconception was that the Russians were this juggernaut of a modern military that had gone through this great modernization process that had these vaunted doctrines, the Gerasimov doctrine, named for the chief of their general staff, their senior military officer, hybrid warfare that they'd mastered, great cyber integration with their military operations and all the rest of that. And then on the other hand, the Ukrainians, again, had a bunch of leftover stuff that, they hadn't trained and they weren't ready for this. And so the people might be motivated, but their military forces wouldn't be all that capable. I think that overlooked the reality that the Ukrainians have been building their military really quite effectively since 2014. They've had a variety of forms of assistance from the U.S. and other NATO countries. A longtime colleague of mine, General John Abizaid, retired by then, helped as a senior military advisor to Ukraine. He was a former U.S. Central Command commander as well. So there's been a lot of effort going on. I saw the Ukrainian military. I visited there several years ago, obviously pre-COVID. I went down to the front lines of the Donbass, and I came back thinking, man, these soldiers have heart. They're ready for this. They're spoiling for a fight, and that they have shown that they are ready for this, and that they have come a very, very long way from when Russia was able to occupy Crimea with no real opposition, and then also to seize parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast provinces in the southeast, the so-called Donbass, supported by Russia. So I think that those are two misconceptions. I think they are getting corrected clearly because the Russians have struggled so much and eventually just withdrew from the northern cities in frustration and after taking huge casualties, and now trying to focus all their efforts in the southeast to try to achieve something that President Putin could present to the Russian nation as an accomplishment worth this horrific cost and worth becoming the international pariah and known as the truly evil empire. So I think those misconceptions are starting to be corrected, but I think there's probably still some lingering elements of that. And certainly the Ukrainians can stop the Russians if we can do everything humanly possible as quickly as we can to scour Eastern Europe for what the kinds of systems and ammunition and so forth that are compatible with what they have. And then on our part, for the kinds of systems that can rapidly be integrated by them without having to go through a long new equipment fielding process, as we call it, because the item is so sophisticated that it requires lengthy training. That's what we need to be doing. We have been quite aggressively doing that, I believe. Our level of assistance, it's over $2 billion or so just in the last 2 months or so. That's an enormous amount of equipment. And then it's another $13 billion. That's a combination of economic and humanitarian assistance. Again, that's just the United States, and all the other NATO countries are chipping in as well. But we've got to do everything we can and not let bureaucracy stand in the way and get what they need to them as quickly as we possibly can.
General, unfortunately, we have to end the conversation here. We could go on. There's so much to unpack. I want to end on just a few Notes from our members. Anthony says, thank you, General, for educating the public about the nature of the war. The public needs to be prepared for rough times that might accompany or follow in the wake of the war. And James says, General Petraeus is one of the most knowledgeable people I know about military operations. His word is his bond. So you've got some fans in the stream.
Thank you. Very kind of you.
Thank you for being here.
Congratulations on all you're doing with LinkedIn.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. That was General Petraeus. He is a partner at KKR Global Institute, and follow him on LinkedIn. He posts a lot, great stuff. And thank you for everyone who joined the show and commented. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your comments, but you can continue the conversation here. You can check out some of our other stories to the right of your feed, or if you're on mobile, click into your search box. Thank you for watching LinkedIn News Live. I'm Nina Melendez. Have a great week.